It would be 14 days after the massive ambulant nemesis, or man for short, had been let loose in the countryside. The ERI had been devastated, both politically and economically, since the last major incident involving the man. Member nations claimed that the ERI should be held accountable for the calamity, as the creature didn't even pass by any of the predicted territories. Panic became fear in the hearts of the Mandari citizens of the ERI's member nations. Businessmen were long gone from the member nations, trying to rule their tycoon empires from abroad. Middle-class families gathered their saving to try to flee to the countryside or go into member nations that had yet to report any signal of man's activity. Those who couldn't afford their private way out of the calamity simply walked on the side roads, marching with what belongings they had. If the impact on the nations themselves was bad, the impact on the ecosystem was even worse. The chemical byproducts of the massive ambulant nemesis were profound. Its liquid byproducts seemed to possess ammonia in strong concentrations, impeding flora and fauna alike to survive wherever the creature chose to discharge its waste. The forestall reserves and virgin wood suffered greatly as the creature found both the foliage and the fauna edible, putting an enormous strain on the biosphere, eating the equivalent of 2 to 3 kilograms of biomass every day. At that rate, the specialists of the ERI would claim that the ecosystem of the place would collapse in 1 month. The Secretary General had to bring a response. With the crisis abating the economy of the member nations and the fiasco that happened in the last encounter, morale was at an all-time low. Since then, the organization lost 30% of its funding, and the Secretary General was pressured to make more with less. His staff rarely saw him anymore. In his office, only documents were allowed to enter, and piles of bureaucratic orders left. Some said he was hard at his work, others said he was drafting some plan. 10 days of hard work was put in this plan. It was an offensive, an attack plan against the man. The plan was a brilliant marketing tool. It was a propaganda success. A plan to take back the lost land to the best, an offensive war that would lay the monster down. First, leaked to the news of all member nations' medias, and soon, the population presumed their governments to grant means to the operation. 200,000 Mandari, 100,000 armored vehicles, 7850 jet crafts and 20,000 rotor crafts were assembled in the first offensive against the man. It was a wonder army, assembled from the 24 nations that comprised the ERI. The first fully mechanized army in the history of the Mandari. It was a paper tiger at best. As soon as they were put together, the problems in logistics appeared. 36 armored vehicle patterns required their unique parts for repairs and spare parts to work. The army was divided in several languages that were not mutually understandable. Most of the officers simply didn't share any common language. And other soldiers bared their own cultural baggage, making attrition between other members of the army a very real thing. The Secretary General would advertise the army as the spearhead to wage the war against a threat, who was sent to drive away the man from the lands it occupies, and eventually slay the monster once and for all. In truth, neither him or his staff believed the statements. However, he had still hoped that the unified army could achieve something, a victory. For as small as it could be, it had to mark a score against the man. Officially, they would be sent to drive the man out of the host nation and take back the ground zero that propaganda claimed was the nest of the creature. In reality, it was a heavy scouting operation. The job was to gather intelligence, engage only the skin parasites that now multiply within the host nation. The 1st ERI division would be the core backup of the operation, being stationed outside the capital. The 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th and 10th Division deployed their long-range artillery far away from the megalopolis. The 3rd ERI Division was to approach the city from the west, where the least amount of damage was received. The fourth and fifth had to approach it from the southeast, where most of the red bodily waste of the man remained, with the second being tasked to enter the center of the city, close to ground zero. It would take 3 days for the army to arrive at the capital of the host nation. What they saw was a thing to behold. The entire megalopolis was in dead silence. Everyone that could have evacuated, leaving the damaged overbuilt city as a dead husk. The few dozen millions that still inhabited the city were most likely surrounded by the toxic waste, incapable of leaving the city. The third passed by millions upon millions of dried out husks of Mandari. Their deaths were slow, exposure to the toxic ammonia and the lack of water, killing them while their countrymen fled, leaving them behind. Some of the soldiers saw movement within the pile of corpses. Something was alive, survivors. As soon as the soldiers started to dig the piles for survivors, they were attacked. Parasites, half the size of an adult Mandari, lapped over the soldiers from the piles of bodies. Their jaws more than a match to the body armor of the soldiers, who unload their guns upon the carapace of the creatures. Wave after wave of those parasites engaged the 3rd Division, eating their way across the armor of the vehicles to eat the soldiers within. The 4th was sent to release the 3rd, their armored spear tip rushing amongst the debris, passing by the solidified red fields of the creature's blood to see a sight to behold. Parasites feeding off the red waste of the creature, 5 times the size of a Mandari, were sighted. The tank commanders didn't hesitate, opening fire against the creatures, blowing limbs as they passed by before the creatures had a chance to react. It was a mistake. The pests were wounded, but the macro cannon shells of the tanks did not cripple them, their massive bulk eating the small caliber cannons like they were nothing. Before, they were passive at the eating of the red playing field, but now they had a target. Soon, the entire city erupted in fire, the aerial attachments battling against the giant parasites, while the infantry battled their way across hundreds of thousands of smaller parasites. The 2nd was the only one that didn't relent. Made of veterans of the host city, they had already faced the parasites before, even if it wasn't in those numbers. They made their way across the center of the city, their numbers growing thin, as they entered the more overbuilt parts of the megalopolis, where no rotorcraft could give aerial support. Day became night, and the battle carried on. The officers of the 3rd and 4th were down to 72% and 59% of their forces. The 5th was completely wiped out, as they found themselves within the nest of the larger parasites, while the 2nd still was within the city center. The outside contingency had long ago started the bombardment of the city. Aerial jet crafts marking concentration zones and granting the division some respite. The commander-in-chief needed to pull out the 3rd and 4th out of the west, but his men were pinned down by the monsters. They needed to reach the 2nd and battle their way out of the city. The decision was made, the 1st was to go in. At night, it was expected that the creatures would have less of an advantage, but it was discovered that their senses didn't abate with the lack of light. Still, they pressed on, battling against fear and monster alike, until the entire contingency was within the center of the city. It was a brutal retreat, many of the wounded had to be left. Survivors found, left to be eaten by the parasites. Entire companies were set as rearguard duty to hold the parasites a little longer. Many of the parasites followed the retreating army into the fields, where they would lose any of their advantages. The larger beasts were bombarded by the aircraft of the unified army. The rest of the unified army opened fire, their artillery running down, not explosive ordnance, but incendiary rounds, across the city, running fire upon the parasites that infested the place. If they wouldn't take the city, it would be a pile of rubble for the parasites. One of the jets passed low across the city. It would be the first witness to something impossible to believe. The larger parasites coiled themselves and jumped across the sky. Immediately, the jet craft scrambled out of their path. It was unbelievable that such massive creatures could jump so far into the sky. The aircraft were immediately dispatched to hunt the fleeing beast, but most of their ammo was already spent in burning the city. Some were killed by sheer brute force and numbers of bullets, others would be the victims of artillery shots, but it was unlikely that all were killed in their retreat. The chief commander sent the rest of the unified army to search and destroy the fleeing parasites. However, the 2nd Division abandoned the battle, stating direct orders from the Secretary General to return to ERI's headquarters, leaving the chief commander without his best troops to cleanse the land surrounding the megalopolis with nothing more than the hatred he felt in his heart. Author's name and the link to original text is in the description. Consider tapping the thumbs up and pressing the subscribe button if you want to listen to the subsequent parts of this story.